The Young and the Restless spoilers. Phyllis Summers had always lived her life in a constant dance between danger and desire, instinct and impulse, ambition and vulnerability, and for most of her adult life she had relied on her own cunning to survive the shifting tides of Genoa City. But something had shifted beneath her feet, something she had not anticipated. Cane Ashby had become a mirror she could not control, a reflection that forced her to confront her own choices in a way few people ever had. Phyllis knew she was standing on the edge of a precipice, and for once, her survival might depend not on manipulation or strategy but on brutal, unflinching honesty. The thought unsettled her more deeply than any confrontation she had faced before. Recent events had carved new fault lines through her life, and on December 1st, the tension finally collided when Cane unexpectedly walked into the middle of a confrontation between her and Lily Winters. The clash between the two women ignited instantly, fueled by history, jealousy, mistrust, and competing stakes, and the moment Lily stormed out, Cane found himself forced into the role of reluctant judge. It was a role he had never sought, yet he had no choice but to take. When Cane declared that he had chosen loyalty, implicitly choosing Lily over Phyllis, it cut deeper than Phyllis wanted to admit. His words were not dramatic, not cruel, but they carried a weight that echoed long after the confrontation was over. For Phyllis, who spent years insisting she needed no one, the sting of rejection was a reminder that she could no longer keep pretending her choices did not have consequences. The realization brought her to an unfamiliar crossroads. She had always believed she could outmaneuver fate, that she could rewrite the narrative with sheer willpower, sharp instincts, and a survivalist heart. But this time the pieces had shifted too far off the board. Cane was slipping away, and she knew why. She had pushed him too far, manipulated too many outcomes, played too many games with half-truths and secrets. And Cane, who had learned through painful experience the cost of deception, had no patience left for shadows. If Phyllis wanted any future with him, romantic, emotional, or even just human, she would need to do something she had avoided for most of her life: tell the truth. The brewing storm centered around 3 confessions that Phyllis had avoided acknowledging aloud, even to herself. But the truth was that she had woven herself into a corporate war she barely understood, one that had entangled Cane's company Arabesque, Victor Newman's relentless ambition, and the controversial AI program that became the catalyst for destruction. She knew that Cane had always suspected she had played some role in the downfall of his company, but he had never been able to prove it. Phyllis had used that uncertainty to her advantage, dancing around the truth with skillful emotional deflection, feigned innocence, and just enough sincerity to keep Cane unsure. But guilt had a way of clinging to the soul, and every time Cane looked at her with a mixture of doubt and hope, she felt the weight of her deception sharpening at the edges of her conscience. The first confession she needed to make was the simplest yet most devastating: she had stolen Cane's AI program. She had justified it at the time as a survival tactic, a necessity born from pressure, desperation, and Victor's looming influence. But the truth was unavoidable. Phyllis had taken something that was not hers, something Cane had poured time, brilliance, and trust into. She had not merely damaged a business, she had violated a belief he held dearly, that innovation and integrity should never be sacrificed for personal gain. Admitting this would mean acknowledging the full scope of the damage she had caused, not just to Arabesque but to Cane himself. The second confession ran deeper. Phyllis had allowed Victor Newman to weaponize the stolen program. She had known Victor's intentions long before he executed them. She had witnessed the precision with which he manipulated that software into a tool capable of dismantling Arabesque from the inside out. She had watched the company crumble, and she had stayed silent. That silence was not passive, it was complicity. Victor had exploited her weaknesses, her ambitions, her desire for leverage, and Phyllis had let him. She had convinced herself at the time that she was choosing the path of least resistance, that resisting Victor was a losing battle. But that rationalization offered little comfort now that she saw the destruction through Cane's eyes. The third confession was the most personal, the most painful, and the most revealing. She had lied to Cane repeatedly, even when he asked her directly whether she had been involved. She had chosen self-preservation over trust, fear over honesty, control over vulnerability. And each lie had chipped away at the fragile connection between them. Phyllis had known all along that Cane valued authenticity, perhaps more than most men. His life with Lily had taught him that love without trust was a hollow shell. His journey through scandal and redemption had taught him that forgiveness could only exist in the presence of truth. And yet she had betrayed that principle again and again. Recognizing these truths did not come easily to Phyllis. She had built her identity around strength, independence, and a refusal to be owned by her mistakes. But Cane was different. The possibility of losing him exposed a rawness she could not ignore. His disappointment, his doubt, his declaration of loyalty. These were not simple emotional blows, they were catalysts forcing her to confront a part of herself she had spent years avoiding. Cane had become a symbol of the life she wanted to create, one shaped by honesty rather than manipulation, connection rather than control. Phyllis found herself contemplating what her life would look like if she chose honesty for once, not as a tactic or strategy but as a genuine act of vulnerability. Could truth actually benefit her? Could confession open a path toward redemption? Could she rebuild trust with Cane by finally acknowledging the pain she had caused? These questions lingered in her mind, heavy and relentless, and for the first time she felt the possibility that honesty might be a form of power she had never allowed herself to use. Meanwhile, Cane wrestled with his own conflict. He had always admired Phyllis's intelligence, her fire, her resilience, but he also knew that being connected to her meant living with unpredictability, secrets, and chaos. When he told her he had chosen loyalty, he had meant it. He had chosen a life grounded in truth, stability, and transparency. Whether that path included Phyllis depended entirely on her next steps. He needed to know whether she could be the partner he hoped she could become, or whether she would remain locked in the patterns that had defined her for so long. As Phyllis stood on the threshold of confession, she understood that her future with Cane did not hinge on perfection or innocence, it hinged on courage. The courage to admit what she had done. The courage to accept the consequences. The courage to let someone see the parts of herself she had always tried to hide. It was a terrifying prospect, yet strangely freeing. Because in the end, these confessions were not merely about Cane. They were about reclaiming her own identity, rewriting the narrative of who she was capable of being, and breaking the cycle of sabotage she had fallen into time and time again. And so Phyllis Summers prepared to confront the truth, not as a tactic, not as a performance, but as a final act of hope. Because if Cane could see the honesty beneath the wreckage, if he could recognize her willingness to change, then perhaps this moment, this painful, exposing, humbling moment, could be the beginning of something real. A chance for redemption. A chance for connection. A chance for a future where she no longer had to hide behind lies. The question now was not whether Cane would forgive her. It was whether Phyllis could forgive herself long enough to admit what needed to be said. Phyllis Summers had always navigated life with an intoxicating mixture of wit, boldness, and reckless determination, yet for all her bravado, she had mastered the art of hiding her heart behind a mosaic of playful flirtation, sarcasm, and distraction. Feelings, real ones, were risks she rarely permitted herself to acknowledge, let alone confess, because vulnerability was a weapon that too many people in Genoa City had learned to exploit against her. But the moment she saw Cane's expression shift during the confrontation with Lily Winters, saw the disappointment, the conflict, the weary fatigue etched into his posture, something inside her cracked open in a way she could not control. It was not the shock of rejection or even the fear of losing him that shook her the most. It was the sudden understanding that she had allowed her deepest emotions to remain buried beneath manipulation and avoidance for so long that Cane truly had no idea how much he meant to her. And with Lily reappearing in his orbit, steady, familiar, safe, Phyllis felt something she hated, fear, the kind that clawed its way up her throat, the kind that whispered that she was about to lose someone before she ever had the courage to claim him. For the second time, she found herself preparing to confess something monumental, But unlike her admission of guilt over the stolen AI software, this confession had nothing to do with corporate sabotage, Victor Newman's machinations, or the relentless chaos she always seemed to attract. This one was personal in a way she rarely allowed anything to be. Phyllis knew she had fallen for Cane Ashby long before she admitted it to herself. It had begun quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the stolen moments when he looked at her with sincerity instead of suspicion, when he challenged her not out of anger but because he believed she could be better, when he refused to let her hide behind her usual deflection. Cane had become a grounding force in her unpredictable life, someone who approached her not with judgment but with possibility. She had grown used to being misunderstood, dismissed, underestimated, but Cane saw the fire in her rather than the destruction, saw her intelligence rather than her mistakes, saw the woman she could become rather than the woman everyone claimed she was. That kind of recognition was addictive, and Phyllis had been addicted long before she was ready to confront it. But now the threat of losing him to Lily had sharpened the edges of everything she had been avoiding. Lily, with her calm rationality, moral clarity, and long history with Cane, represented a version of stability Phyllis feared she could never offer. And perhaps because of that, she had spent months pretending that her connection with Cane was nothing more than strategic camaraderie, playful tension, a convenient meeting of two complicated souls. But deep down, she knew that she had always wanted more. Lily's return only forced her to confront how deeply she wanted it. And while jealousy alone was not enough to motivate transparency, the pain of imagining Cane walking away from her for good pushed her toward a vulnerability she had spent years avoiding. She realized that if she did not speak now, if she did not peel back the layers and let Cane see something raw and unguarded, she would lose him without ever giving him the chance to choose her. This confession required a different version of Phyllis, one that terrified her. A Phyllis without the armor, without the clever distractions, without the smirk that concealed every trembling emotion beneath it. She would need to look him in the eyes and admit that her feelings were not a game, not a passing attraction, not a moment of convenience born from shared chaos. They were real, deep, stubborn, and frightening in their intensity. She needed him to understand that this was not a ploy to win him over Lily, not a strategy to manipulate sympathy, but a truth she had been fighting within herself far longer than she had been fighting for his forgiveness. She felt something powerful for him, something she had not allowed herself to feel for a man in years. And that truth alone was enough to shake the foundation of everything she thought she understood about her own heart. But her third confession was equally daunting, because it required more than emotional honesty, it required action, sacrifice, and a willingness to challenge the very forces that had shaped the disaster Cane was now facing. Phyllis understood that she had played a direct role in Cane's recent entanglement with Victor. She had enabled the downfall of Arabesque through her involvement with the stolen AI program and through her cooperation, however reluctant, with Victor's manipulative strategies. And now, as Cane stood on precarious ground because of the consequences she helped create, she knew that an apology was not enough. Words would not rebuild what had been lost. Cane needed more from her. He needed a demonstration of loyalty, one that went beyond affection or personal confession. He needed proof that she was willing to fight for him, not just feel for him. And so she began to consider the unthinkable. What if she used her knowledge, her scheming skills, her resourcefulness? The very traits that had once contributed to Cane's downfall, to help him rise again? What if she turned her talents toward undermining Victor Newman rather than enabling him? What if she designed a plan, not to save herself but to help Cane reclaim control, dignity, and power? Phyllis had hinted before about a mysterious new project she was working on, and though she had not revealed its purpose, it had always been more than a casual endeavor. It had been her insurance policy, her way out, her contingency plan should Victor ever turn on her or should her involvement in the AI scandal resurface. But now she saw a different possibility. Her secret project could become a weapon, not one of destruction, but of restoration. It could be the means by which she helped Cane strike back, recover what he had lost, and perhaps even build something stronger than Arabesque had ever been. Yet this idea came with enormous risk. To help Cane, she would need to betray Victor, a man who neither forgave nor forgot betrayal. Victor had used her once, he could easily destroy her if she stepped out of line. Phyllis knew that crossing Victor Newman was the kind of gamble that could erase her from Genoa City entirely. But the more she thought about Cane, his integrity, his pain, his disappointment, the more she felt that nothing short of a bold, defiant gesture would be enough to prove her sincerity. She had already ruined too much. Perhaps now she could repair something, even if it required her to sacrifice everything. And in that realization, she felt something strange, something like clarity, something like purpose, something like redemption. For once, she was not acting out of self-interest. She was acting out of love. The plan she envisioned was dangerous, intricate, and potentially explosive. It would require gathering evidence, undermining Victor's leverage, exposing weaknesses, and aligning herself entirely with Cane. It would also require her to confess everything, to reveal her involvement in the AI scandal, her emotional investment in Cane, and the full scope of her project. Only then could Cane decide whether to trust her, whether to join her, whether to build something new with her, whether to choose her over Lily. And though the thought terrified her, Phyllis understood that she could no longer hide behind manipulation. If Cane chose Lily in the end, she would accept it, but she refused to lose him without giving him the truth. The final realization came to her quietly, almost peacefully. Honesty might not save her, but it would at least free her. And for a woman who had spent years tangled in her own lies and schemes, freedom was something she had nearly forgotten how to crave. Phyllis Summers stood on the edge of her greatest transformation, torn between fear and hope, guilt and love, destruction and redemption. And as she prepared to confess the final two truths, the depth of her feelings and the magnitude of her plan, she understood that this was her last chance to reshape her future, not just with Cane but with herself. Whatever happened next would define her. And for once, she was ready to let the truth speak for her.